This is something that has been debated in Egypt over the past couple of months, ever since Egypt was declared to be one of the new members to join Brics. The admission of countries like Egypt or Iran or Saudi Arabia or Ethiopia or whatever to Brics is not just economic. It has its own geopolitical part. Tourism, the bulk of the tourist flows go to the Red Sea. And apparently we are getting some negative implications because of the war. You have these.
Hi everyone, my name is Sukanya Saha and you're watching The New Indian. Our today's guest is very special. He's Mr. Amr Adly, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the American University in Cairo. He's also the author of Cleft Capitalism, The Social Origins of Failed Market Making in Egypt. Hi Amr, welcome to the show.
Hi, Spain.
So, considering Egypt's current economic challenges, what, in your opinion, are the potential benefits and drawbacks of joining Brics?
So, thanks of course for having me. It's a pleasure, and this is something that has been debated in Egypt over the past couple of months, ever since Egypt was declared to be one of the new members to join Brics, and of course. I don't think that we have like immediate term changes that we are looking at. Of course, Egypt is now in a very critical economic position. We have been facing a problem exacerbated by higher interest rates on the dollar. The country has already a huge external debt. And to cut a long story short, Egypt has been very negatively exposed to a number of financial as well as economic, but also geopolitical shocks over the past year and a half that have resulted in a very acute economic crisis, translating into high inflation rates, as well as strong signs of an economic slowdown. So the idea, of course, of joining an economic grouping like the Brics is usually thought of in strategic terms. Meaning that Egypt, as a lower middle income country that has huge economic and financial needs for development in the future, has been keen on diversifying its partnerships, its institutional commitments. And of course, joining Brics, which includes the biggest countries in the global south and some of the biggest economies in the world, serves that strategic goal. But whether this is going to have a direct impact on the options that are already available for a country like Egypt to face or to address these challenges is something that is very doubtful.
So the media debate in Egypt portrays joining Brics as both a panacea for economic troubles and a futile endeavor. How do you assess the accuracy of these contrasting views, and what factors should be considered in evaluating the impact of Egypt's economy, you think?
I don't think it's a futile endeavor really in the long term, meaning that it's something that adds prestige to like a middle power like Egypt within the international global system. And of course, you need to bear in mind that the admission of countries like Egypt or Iran or Saudi Arabia or Ethiopia or whatever to Brics is not just economic. It has its own geopolitical part. It has its own geopolitical connotation. And it is also related to the big designs that you have for what the Brics is going to serve in the future. And there, of course, you have the bigger questions about the convergence or divergence of the interests of the major founding countries of Brics, especially India versus China, as well as the role that Brazil might seek to play within Brics. But of course, the big question of how Egypt is going to deal with the rising role of China in the Middle East and North Africa. Egypt is quite central in the Belt and Road Initiative. It's one of the biggest partners that China has in the region. And hence, in the long term, joining Brics might help Egypt in diversifying its investment in partnerships, meaning that we have strong relations with the EU, we have strong relations with the US, and it cannot hurt to have good relations with the Chinese. So in term, I think it's something that is subject to so many variables, having to do with the coherence within BRICS, the future of BRICS itself, and what kind of change BRICS can eventually deliver to global governance. That's a very big open-ended question that definitely goes beyond Egypt. What I can say is that the countries that have been admitted to BRICS or invited to join BRICS several months ago, including Egypt, were given that basically thanks to their political and geopolitical importance, not their economic weight. Neither Egypt nor Ethiopia nor Iran. Of course, the two exceptions would be Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, which are major oil producers as well as major exporters of finance, of capital, I mean. But other than that, it tells you that there are certain political dynamics that have been driving this.
Instead of joining BRICS, why doesn't Egypt pursue bilateral agreements with each of these nations individually, the original BRICS members?
That's an excellent question. One of the problems here is that pretty much like the founding members of BRICS, the one economic common denominator between them all is China. Meaning that if you take a look, India has strong relations with China economically. Brazil does, South Africa. So China is pretty much the thing that is in common between the BRICS founding members. And that applies also to the countries that have been invited to join BRICS. We already have strong bilateral relations with China, like so many other countries. Ones, of course, that are not exactly like what you have between China and Southeast Asia or China and South Asia. They are like of a milder form of exchange. But you definitely have like an increasing role of China when it comes to trade in Egypt as well as investment, debt to a lesser extent, because of course Egypt's patrons are still either within the region, if you talk about the oil-rich countries, like Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, or the EU remaining Egypt's biggest trade partner. But this is changing somehow, and this again gets us back to the future of BRICS, because it seems that like China has its own plans for the use of BRICS as well as other tools. And to what extent is this going to create a homogeneous agenda for changing economic governance on a world scale with the big other major partners? Again, if you think of especially India, Russia, and Brazil, do these countries have a lot in common? Not to mention, of course, that if you add in non-economic factors, you would have more divergence in interest between India and China, between Russia and China. So in that sense, it's very complicated. I think that Egypt is one of the biggest economies in Africa. It usually competes with Nigeria and South Africa as like 1, 2, 3. Egypt is one of the most promising economies in Africa, but of course we have to bear in mind that Africa is the one part of the world, and we are very much part in Africa, that has been marginalized by the forces of globalization and that has suffered considerably over the past 30 or 40 years. And North Africa has done a bit better than the rest of Africa, but at the end of the day, we are caught pretty much in a similar situation. So finding partners away from the usual ones in the global north is something that can potentially help. Of course, how this is going to play out is something that is not very clear, especially that in the Middle East and North Africa, you can already see that it's a very unstable region. And it seems to be always in the very heart of major geopolitical changes. And this is something that is already happening as we speak. Like the Israeli war on Gaza, for instance, is something that has already had ramifications for like the maritime routes in the Red Sea, all the way to the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. And that itself is something that raises questions about the future military presence of all of the big powers, the future of the trade passing through the Suez Canal. And this is more geopolitics than economics, even though it is very much economic at the same time. So these are very uncertain times when it comes to this.
Proponents argue that the BRICS membership could reduce Egypt's reliance on the US dollar and inflation. Do you agree with this perspective?
Yes, in principle, definitely. In principle, it can. But again, we have so many intermediate variables, meaning that to start with, how developed are the alternative financial channels? So within BRICS, you have had this push towards institutionalization in the past years that resulted in the creation of the new development bank, as well as like the how's it called, the CRE, which is like the contingent reserve arrangement, which was meant to replace partly or fully the IMF. These haven't developed very much yet, indicating problems with institutionalization of cooperation within BRICS, which remains, by the way, an informal economic grouping. Facing problems with the degree of institutionalization and future integration. That puts limits on the amount of resources that can be made available within the framework of BRICS, for instance. And this is already showing that you have greater dependency on Chinese financing, either via Chinese banks directly or through something like the AIIB, like the Asian Infrastructure like Investment Bank, which is very much Chinese dominated. And Egypt already has access to these. But at the end of the day, the question would become, yes, diversifying is something that is good, but in which currency is this going to take place? So like as a burgeoning alternative is using local currencies, something that has its own limitations. But is BRICS capable of coming up with an alternative currency to the US? I have no idea. I'm very, very doubtful given the circumstances. And most probably this is not something that would eventually happen in the coming 10 or 20 years even. So in that sense, it would become, again, like having more patrons is something that can help in improving the terms according to which access to credit is had on a global level. But it stops there. Like no big hopes, not much bigger hopes, especially that we have countries in Africa as well as in South Asia, but mainly in Africa, that have already shown that shifting your the dependence on debt from the West to China is not necessarily something that's good. So we have already come across this in Zambia. We have already come across this in Kenya. We are already, like most probably we will go through this with Ethiopia, because Ethiopia today made a declaration that made it very close to declaring bankruptcy, not being able to service its debt. And China is a major creditor. So in that sense, again, like I would be more careful in our assessment. Of course, part of the debate in Egypt was driven by the perceived vulnerabilities vis-a-vis the West, which is something, of course, that, similar to South Asia, comes with a historical baggage of like related to colonialism, to imperialism, to neo-colonial practices, etc. So moving away from the West is something that is inherently good in a way, yet the terms the terms upon which this is going to happen is something that we need to think well about, especially that you have this very similar power asymmetries tying a country like Egypt or a country like South Africa to China.
So how do you spoke about the Gaza war earlier? How will the Gaza conflict affect the economies of both Egypt and the broader Middle East?
Well, in the immediate term, of course, we in Egypt we have been negatively impacted. Like tourism, the bulk of the tourist flows go to the Red Sea, and apparently we are getting some like negative implications because of the war. You have these tourists coming from Europe postponing or not coming, basically. That's on the one hand. But then in the short term, at least, I hope not in the long term or in the medium term, in the short term, the problems in the Red Sea are likely to impact the Suez Canal revenues. And the Suez Canal revenues are quite important they are not like as big as one would imagine, but they are definitely a very important source for foreign currency earnings. That's in the short term. But then in the medium to long term, of course, it's just like adding more and more instability to a region that is very unstable. And this is something that is likely to have a negative impact on Egypt as well as elsewhere, either having to do with refugees, having to do with even like the like more financial resources being dedicated to armament, to security, etc. Like these are like these have their own negative impact on the standards of living, etc. And the Middle East and North Africa have shown some of the highest, if not the single highest, percentages of military expenses to GDP, which comes at the cost of the standards of living of the majority, of course.
So, in your view, how realistic is the expectation that joining BRICS could lead to a shift in the international order, reducing Western economic dominance?
I think that this is something that has already started happening economically. Like many of the Western, like if forget about the West, really, it's more about the core. Because then you think of Europe, you think of the US and Canada, as well as Japan. All three have significantly witnessed a sheer decline in their overall weight. And this had to do with the increasing weight in the past 30 to 40 years of Asia, especially Northeast and Southeast Asia, but mainly Northeast Asia. And so this is something that is happening as we speak. How this is going to impact the global governance norms and structures is a political process that is going to be dependent on so many other variables. And the BRICS might play such a role, especially that you have, well, like all four big economies, plus China, being interested in changing the rules of the game. The rules of the game were originally set by the US almost unilaterally after the end of World War II. And these global southern economies have been brought into a system that had its rules designed by the US and that mainly served the interests of the US. At a certain point, this cannot continue. But whether the change is going to be more reformist or whether an alternative system will emerge with the US hegemony declining, which is something that's very visible. The US hegemony is very much declining as we speak on many fronts. But how this is exactly going to happen is so full of uncertainties and usually is quite chaotic, these times of transition. It seems that like the US has become a force somehow pushing for the unmaking of some of the rules that are no longer serving its own interests. And this is like has resulted in some elements of deglobalization, like rising protectionism, decline in international trade, the whole idea of restricting the flow of capital and technology into some parts of the global south. All of these will have their own ramifications. So how will eventually the global southern countries come together to design an alternative governance structure is a very open-ended question, because it depends on how much they will be capable of organizing or coordinating this on the one hand. There are big differences between them on the one hand, but also how they are going to relate to the core countries, because the core countries are not going anywhere. I mean, like, until now, these are the biggest trade partners of China itself.
Right.
So how is this going to change is, I don't know. I don't think that we have any clear signs yet. Like the dollar is very much there. China has been saving mainly in dollars, in US dollars. And these are signs of being integrated into a US-led system. How this is going to change, whether this is going to change at all, is subject to so many other variables.
So you feel that BRICS expansion, the BRICS Plus group, can take over the economic hegemony of G7?
Yes and no. Because the G7 is much more cohesive than BRICS. The G7 has a clear head, which is the US. And this had to do with the historical conditions within which the G7 emerged. Like with the US conquering pretty much Japan and Germany and dominating like Western Europe militarily as well as politically. So the idea is that the US is the boss. So the G7 is, in that sense, they have one clear head. They are all, and they like, this is, of course, something that doesn't come without its own troubles. It comes with its troubles, but they do have this. Is China going to be as like ahead of an alternative G7 like grouping? I doubt it.
Yeah.
I doubt like that, because it's like, this is not how things like, this is not how BRICS came into existence. It's not. And as I was saying, it's far less coherent, like economically as well as geopolitically.
Yeah. So, given the historical regional differences, how likely is it that Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, and the UAE can collaborate effectively within BRICS?
Well, an interesting question would be how can they collaborate outside of BRICS even? So if you can imagine here that, yeah, like with the instability and the geopolitical tension in the region, these are countries that are either outright rivals or they have some major differences. Of course, the US, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt have formed somehow a bloc. There are some differences, but overall, they have been working together. The big question is going to be that of Iran. And Iran's position has improved significantly in the region over the past 3 or 4 years, having to do with being closer to Russia and China, who have been investing in the relationship with Iran, I think, as a means of challenging the US. So that can create an interesting dynamic here, because what I find extremely interesting is that Saudi Arabia and the UAE are themselves very keen on diversifying their partnerships. So like Saudi Arabia resumed diplomatic relations with Iran based on an unprecedented Chinese mediation, which is very strange, because this has never happened before. It was never part of Chinese diplomacy, yet it happened. So in that sense, it's extremely interesting that things may change. The UAE and Saudi Arabia have thrown themselves quite closer to Russia in the Ukraine war, especially when it comes to the management of international oil prices away from the US, as a matter of fact, and other oil importing countries. So that does not mean that, like, these are times of very high uncertainty. So they might eventually collaborate within the bounds of BRICS, definitely. But this will require, again, reaching some kind of an arrangement within the region.
So, looking at the broader context, how might joining BRICS impact Egypt's relationship with its traditional Western allies, especially considering historical instances where Egypt refrained from such international alliances to avoid straining its ties with the West?
Well, for a middle power like Egypt, it has always been like getting back to the dynamics of the Cold War is a dream come true.
Yeah.
It can never hurt. So is Egypt going to sever ties with the US? No, it will never do that. But Egypt has moved away from the US over the past 10 years, by the way, meaning that it has diversified its military imports to include more European, but also Russian producers. It's always very complicated when it comes to this. You can think of India, for instance. India has had very close ties with Russia. It's a rival of China, but is very close economically to China, and at the same time has its own calculations having to do with the West. Like, it's, in that sense, it's always very complicated. I mean, it's always very complicated. So that applies pretty much to a middle power like Egypt, where they want to have a bigger role to play in the Chinese plans, without necessarily undermining, at least now, their relations with the EU and the US.
So, speaking of big guys within the BRICS, after the BRICS expansion, who do you think will emerge as the leader of the global South, India or China?
Well, that's it's a $1 billion question, because like, you know what, objectively, I think that India is much closer to the global south because India is a genuinely is a country that is genuinely within the global south. China is not. China is too big for the global south, and that's why the problems of reproducing the same kind of exploitative relationships between the global south and China are there. The risk, at least, China is very much aware of this because they know that this is the one thing that makes them close to the global south and makes them powerful at the same time. But it creates so many problems. So there is something genuine in what the Indians are saying in terms of, you know what, we are like, we look much more like Africa. We look much more like Latin America than the Chinese. It might be true, but at the end of the day, China is very big economically, and it's the one thing that ties all of these countries together, everyone together. So China is a global power economically. And in that sense, how is India going to find its own interests in a world where China is that big? Again, economically, the Indians have treaded a very interesting path because they have developed very strong economic ties with the Chinese. So to what extent can China find a good place for the Indian path of development within I'm not sure, a counter-hegemonic, yeah, we can say it this way, a counter-hegemonic globalization project.
Yeah.
It seems that India has is itself interested in like choosing and picking between the Chinese and the West.
So that's it, Amr. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Thanks a lot. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for watching us, guys. Have a nice rest of the day.
For such fine news breaks and video features from ground on your mobile phones, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, The New Indian, by clicking on the bell icon. Also, follow us on the social media handles on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook and Co.